Earlier in this course, we discussed document design and ways to legally use other media in your documents and presentations. In this lesson, we will focus more on images and visuals that you create, particularly those which allow you to convey information. First, let's talk about informational graphics. When you include graphics in a document, you need to label them according to type, a convention which dates to pre-digital publishing days when the type of graphic influenced how many pages could be printed and what machines could be used. Graphics are either tables or figures. Figure covers every other type of graphic besides tables. Each graphic should have an accompanying label and title, but including a caption as well is often a good idea. Tables are pretty much boxes with rows and columns, and they most likely contain information in each box. When you use a table in your work, you should create your own, rather than copying one that another person has made. In addition, you need to cite where the information in the table comes from in the table's caption. When you use a table, the label is Table 1, Table 2, etc. The title of the graphic should be descriptive. It should accurately convey the subject matter. It should also be a statement, not a question, as the data displayed isn't asking a question, but answering a question. Tables are best used to convey large amounts of numerical data. Comparison tables are a good way to compare different qualities of related items. They can also be closely related to decision matrices. Depending on the qualities picked for the first column, comparison tables can be very persuasive tools for explaining why one product is better than another. You may be and should be strategic when choosing the items for column 1, but don't be deceitful or purposely misleading. On the other hand, the term figure usually covers all graphics except tables. The distinction really only matters for labeling purposes. Some types of figures are bar graphs, line graphs, pie charts, photos, and drawings. Your figures should be labeled Figure 1, Figure 2, etc., and should include a title. Captions can be useful, but whether or not they are necessary depends on context or content. Both figures and tables need to be actually mentioned or discussed in your body text, rather than being left there to float without an anchor. As with tables, you should make your own figures rather than using ones from your sources. If you are using software such as Google Forms to conduct a survey, you should also avoid using the figure that is generated automatically, as often the form of the figure isn't the most appropriate. When you use charts and graphics to communicate information, you need to be sure to choose the appropriate forms. Line graphs are generally good for showing change over time. Scatter plots with time on one axis are good for showing trends when individual data points may vary. Pie charts are good for showing relative percentages when all the different options are relevant, though they are not at all useful for data with 2 or fewer options and are only sometimes useful when there are more than 7 options. Bar graphs are good for comparing numbers that are not percentages, such as prices, or comparing percentages when not all parts are relevant. For instance, if your answers to a survey question would give you more than 7 slices in a pie chart, you could consider including the most relevant 4 answers as bars on a graph if that is sufficient to illustrate the information you wish to convey. Infographics and flowcharts are good for explaining processes that are important or complex. Keep in mind the principles of document design that you have been practicing the whole semester: proximity, alignment, repetition, and contrast. Make sure that your graphics appear integrated with your document, through repeated color, for instance. On the other hand, make sure that the text of the label, title, and caption have sufficient contrast from the text of the body of your document. No matter what type of table or figure, avoid chart junk as your textbook discusses. Make sure that the graphic is easily readable with clearly and specifically labeled areas, axes, and content. Make sure that the graphic isn't purposely misleading. Never, ever, 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 ever use 3D for an informational graphic. If a pie chart is in 3D, it visually distorts slices and can lead to misunderstanding of the comparative slice sizes. If a bar graph is in 3D, the audience may be confused as to why the bar should be read from the front or the back. 3D graphics are like capes. They may look good, but they are usually impractical. No capes! Be wary of creating a graphic in one place and importing it across platforms, especially if you resize it. This can often mess up the font kerning and look untidy. Pay attention to details like the fonts used for numbers or axis labels, and make sure they fit within your document's design. So far, we have discussed graphics whose role is to communicate information, whether data from a survey through a bar graph or volunteers' attitudes towards an event through photographs. Another form of graphic that you may find yourself using is a visual argument. That is, a graphic whose content makes an argument without primarily relying on words. Here are a few examples. You mostly can understand what these visuals are saying, though you may have slightly different interpretations than other members of the audience. When you make a visual argument, pay attention to the elements of design and the elements of the visual arts. These elements include balance, proportion, emphasis, variety, movement, rhythm, harmony, color, form, line, shape, space, texture, and value. Whether your graphics are informational, are arguments in themselves, or are a mixture of the two, remember that the same basic persuasive principles of logos, ethos, and pathos still apply. Graphics can be extremely helpful as you work to convey information, make your point, and keep your audience's attention. Use them as often as you wish.